All right. So talking about systems tonight. We are going to focus primarily on the concept that you'll have, of course, different types of questions covered when it comes to, of course, obviously different progress checks, and in association, kind of the end of course progress check will correlate pretty well with the actual check ride. So you're going to see, of course, the same system questions come up, but with obviously deeper and deeper focus when it comes to each individual progress check. So of course we start out kind of basic, then move further in from there in association. So that's kind of the idea. So obviously systems are really important. Obviously the question could be why are systems important? Let's talk about a couple of different perspectives. People may have seen this before. The airplane below the B-29 is a Bell X-1, which was the first airplane to break the sound barrier. Most people probably know who flew that airplane, which was Chuck Yeager. Also, however, Chuck chose Bob Hoover as basically the next in line. In fact, Bob flew the chase plane, if I'm not mistaken, on the first flight that broke the sound barrier. So what's the point? The point is that these were pretty good pilots, but one of the reasons why they were really good test pilots was because they knew systems really, really well. Chuck Yeager was a crew chief before he became a pilot, and certainly became a test pilot. So in association, the more we know about systems in our airplane and the more we know about general systems in association, we're just simply going to be better off in making good decisions in a given scenario or situation. So on the opposite of that spectrum, we actually have a situation that occurred close to home a few years ago. So this is actually the basic analysis of a unfortunately fatal accident that occurred literally, like I said, right in our own backyard in Orlando, Florida. Yes, but specifically this airplane actually went down in Clear Lake, which is literally on the approach corridor to runway 7. So it had some unfortunate avoidable circumstances that certainly led to the ultimate incident. In this case, we've got a situation where if we just, if we read quickly through the analysis, you have a guy departing Orlando Executive Airport. He inadvertently flies into Class B airspace, and then after flying into Class B airspace, he's instructed by the local controller to basically remain or exit and then remain outside of Class Bravo. And in so doing, most likely at that point, probably the autopilot was engaged, and the pilot most likely pushed, or very likely pushed against the autopilot, which was in a climb or commanded climb, to get it to descend, or to get the airplane specifically to descend. And in association, that induced basically a series of runaway trims, or as we call them in this case, pilot-induced runaway trims, because as you push against the flight controls when the autopilot's engaged, the autopilot simply thinks that that's some type of force that's trying to pose what it's intending to do, so it continues to trim against that. The biggest issue, if we continue to read on, is that for about 5 minutes he struggled with this. Eventually calling on the radio for help, another pilot, or a couple of pilots tried to assist him, told him to pull the breaker. He said he did, and it still didn't disengage. Eventually, of course, a pilot said that you should turn off the master, and that obviously will kill electrical power to everything, including the autopilot, and should certainly take care of the situation. But at that point, it doesn't state it in the analysis, but he actually responded on the radio, well, won't that shut my engine off? So on top of not really knowing the airplane that he's in very well. Secondly, there's a clarity that he doesn't know basic systems, because of course all airplanes obviously don't use the battery to create ignition power for the engine to run. So without understanding that, without knowing the specifics about his airplane, coupled with the reality that they found the airplane fully trimmed out, and then of course because of that, was unable to maintain control of the airplane trying to turn back towards the airport, most likely lost control due to a stall spin, and of course impacted the lake, unfortunately killing the pilot and a passenger on board. So we kind of take it to the other end of the spectrum, that systems knowledge, of course, can make you a great pilot. The lack of systems knowledge can, of course, make you, unfortunately, a dangerous pilot as well. So tonight's agenda, we want to talk about systems questions that focus on, of course, the phase 2 progress check. These are literally some questions that you could be asked on either the phase 2, the phase 5, or the phase 10 progress check. Emily, this is for the private, so anyone who already has their private, sorry. I'm thankful that you're here. Hopefully you'll gather something. I know that there's a couple of people here that are, of course, going to be working or already working on their flight instructor certificates. Of course, this is a great way to prepare for that as well. All right, so let's jump in. Let's talk about some questions in phase 2. Bear in mind that if I pull something up real quick, I want to emphasize that while we're going to be using slides, I'm going to be trying to show you where to look up answers. So I'm not just going to be answering these questions and speaking about them. I will, of course, certainly expound on things and certainly use some pictures that I have when I'm able. But the majority of this is trying to not only show you the answer to these questions, the thought process behind them, of course, and of course the real importance of them, but also to show you where to look the information up, as if we didn't know the information, and we were studying for it. So remember that, of course, these questions largely pertain to the progress check sheets that we have instructors, of course, refer to. So if we look at, for example, the private phase 2 oral, we've got operation of systems here. We've got power plant, fuel, ignition, engine oil, possibly flight controls, though I don't think I have any questions on flight controls tonight. So let's take a look at some of these questions that could be asked. Kind of an intro question, of course. This one should come as no surprise to anyone. Describe the engine on this airplane. Let's see, I didn't know what that information was. Obviously, we can get quite specific with this. We could stay quite general. We could simply say, oh, it's a reciprocating engine, and leave it at that. Is that satisfactory? Probably not, because we're not just talking about general systems knowledge. In this case, this question, of course, more pertains specifically to our particular airplane, right? So where in this case do I go if I'm unsure of this information? And so if we think about the question is specific. It's not general. So in comparison, if we're talking about specific knowledge, then of course we don't necessarily go to the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Maybe that would give us some additional insight to things, but when we're talking about specifics, that of course really needs to refer therefore to the Pilot's Operating Handbook or the Information Manual. So we're going to head to the Pilot's Operating Handbook. The next thing, of course, that we could answer, of course, is where in this book do we look this information up? You've got, of course, the table of contents. If we look at the table of contents, if we answer the question, just generally speaking, what section is this going to be found in? We've got general limitations, emergency procedures, so on and so forth. Where do we think this is going to be? Well, pretty obvious that probably the best place to head to get a full systems description on our engine is obviously section 7. So let's head to section 7 here. And then from there, we're going to find the table of contents at the beginning of the section. And of course, obviously find where the engine information pages would be found. So a little bit too far still. So we can see the engine at the bottom of the table of contents starts on 7-29. So let's find 7-29. Let's see if I can hit the jackpot here. Pretty close, so we'll sweep from there. And so generally the answer we're looking for is pretty much found in this top paragraph. So this engine is ultimately a direct drive engine, which means that there's no gear transition or gear reduction box. In other words, the engine spins at the same speed the propeller does. There's no speed difference between the two. Horizontally opposed, that means that the cylinders are situated horizontally opposed from each other or across from each other, unlike a V engine, a V8, or an inline, or a big old radial that you've seen on old aircraft engines. 4 cylinders, of course, overhead valve, air-cooled, fuel injected, as opposed to a carbureted engine with a wet sump oil system. That even kind of goes beyond what we're necessarily looking for as far as the wet sump, but certainly everything up into that point, good information. It's one thing, of course, to memorize the Lycoming model number so we can spit that out, but what does that really mean to us? That would be, of course, kind of an expected follow-up question. What does it mean if it's a Lycoming IO360 L2A? So if we break that down, of course, the I means fuel injected. The O means horizontally opposed. And 360 represents the size of the engine, more or less, more specifically, the displacement. In other words, the volume of air and fuel that is moved. If we were to take a complete stroke of the engine, that would be the volume of air moved for each cycle. And then lastly, the L2A is the accessories package, which they go right into the accessories right after this. We'd also, of course, benefit to know, of course, what kind of horsepower we can produce at maximum performance, and of course, the association, the maximum rated RPM. That would be a totally satisfactory answer in my part, or for my part. The accessories knowledge, great stuff too. You're certainly going to need to know it later, so there's nothing wrong with reviewing it now. I don't want to get too long on some of these intro questions because we got plenty to talk about. So let's jump ahead to the next question. Why does the intake valve open and close? What's the purpose of the intake valve, in other words? And secondly, on what stroke does this occur? So once again, let's say I don't know the answer to this question. Where do I find this information? Well, now we're moving outside of specific aircraft knowledge and more to general systems knowledge. So this is most likely to be found in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Now, if you've read our study guide, you'll know that there are great videos out there in association, but if we're just talking about reading, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge is your best bet. Now, I've got a bookmark for this, but the bookmark's not going to be too helpful. That's not what I want to do. So, bookmarked right here, we can answer that question. But more importantly, where is this found? This is found, big surprise, in Chapter 7, Aircraft Systems Knowledge. And early on in the chapter, they, of course, get into the cycling of a reciprocating engine. We can see clearly right here in this step process, as the piston, of course, is traveling downward away from the top of the cylinder. Excuse me. Of course, that's going to create suction. You can see the intake valve is located here, which obviously allows our fuel and air mixture to enter the cylinder. And then obviously, if the intake valve doesn't close, then we don't have a contained pressurized system. And without that, you're not going to get good compressions, or in other words, you're not going to get very good performance out of the engine. So remember that later, because there's another question that kind of pertains to this. So that's why the intake valve needs to open. It needs to open so that obviously we bring our fuel air mixture into the cylinder, and then in association it obviously needs to close so that on the following step, the compression step, we get a closed system, so we get the very effect that we're trying to obviously get. Otherwise, not going to be a very good compression, and in association, you're probably not going to have a very good power stroke either. You know what? I forgot the second question. All right. On what stroke does that occur? I guess we already answered that. So that's obviously going to occur on the intake stroke. It's going to close obviously by the compression stroke. So that's the answer to that question. All right. So moving along, what are we checking for when we perform a Magneto check during the before takeoff checklist? I'm sure everybody's done this so many times that they probably nearly have the before takeoff checklist memorized, but just as a reference, let's open that up. And so we'll find this here under airplane checklist. Sorry, just admitting somebody else that was in the waiting room that I didn't notice. All right, sorry, Johnny, if you've been waiting long. Okay, so before takeoff checklist, we obviously know that we perform a run-up, and then of course in association, we're looking for our Magneto check to ensure that we have, oops, why did I do that? A tolerance of 175 drop on either individually selected Magneto and an association not more than 50 between the two. But why? Why do we care? Well, obviously, that requires us to understand, of course, basic ignition systems. We know that the magnetos ultimately, of course, provide ignition source for our spark plugs to arc properly. So if either the plugs are, of course, fouled, and if we're not familiar with the phrase fouled, what does that mean? It means that, of course, if we looked at a spark plug, we would see basically trash on it, more specifically carbon deposits, because of a myriad of different reasons. Oftentimes, the mixture hasn't been properly leaned, and so we've been running excessively rich, which is obviously why we lean the mixture during ground taxi, is to avoid that. But it also could, of course, be a problem with the magneto itself. We can possibly remedy a spark plug that is fouled by increasing the temperature inside the cylinders as they create the power stroke, and of course in association, those exhaust gas temperatures are going to heat up enough to where they will kind of burn off the carbon if it's not too dirty. If it's too dirty, it's going to have to be mechanically cleaned, and so we will probably not be able to solve that problem on our own. Certainly, if it's a problem with the magneto, there's not anything you can do there except obviously return the airplane and have it inspected by maintenance personnel, and of course they solve the problem from there. The key, of course, obviously is therefore that when we do our magneto check, we're ensuring that both the spark plugs are in good operating condition and also the magnetos themselves are in good operating condition. The key, of course, is obviously when we select the ignition from both to either left or right, then obviously what we're doing is we're grounding out one magneto while allowing the other magneto to operate, and therefore allow us to inspect its condition as well as the spark plugs that it operates, their condition as well. Okay, let's jump ahead. Our next question, real simple, basic concept. Why do we have oil in our engine? What does the oil system specifically provide for our engine? Now, this could actually go either way. You'll see this discussed on a basic level in the specific systems knowledge for a particular airplane, and it would obviously also be discussed in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. So you really could take your pick on this one. Let's take a look at what Cessna's Pilot's Operating Handbook manual has to say. So we're going to head back to the Pilot's Operating Handbook. We're going to open up, of course, to our systems page. Let me clear out my notation there. And we're going to jump ahead to the lubrication system. So what does it say here? Well, in this case, it's not going to get too much into detail about the benefits. It's already going to start talking about specific systems knowledge, but it does say the engine utilizes a full pressure wet sump type lubrication system with aviation grade oil as the lubricant. So that's one of our answers right there. The oil lubricates the engine because obviously big hunks of metal moving at very high speed, rubbing up against other pieces of metal, is not going to do so well. It's going to get really hot in association if it's not properly lubricated. So we now know that it would be lubricate. It would also, of course, be to help manage the heat of the engine. And it would also help clean the engine, or keep at least any kind of components that can help dirty up the engine and therefore cause further degradation of the engine by keeping it clean. Where could we find this information if we're talking about this specific in relation to the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge? Well, let's take a look. So do we think it's in the systems knowledge chapter? Most likely. So let's see if we can find this together. So we can see it's talking about propellers for a little bit, carbureted and fuel injected systems. Then it gets into superchargers. Then it gets into ignition, and it gets into, lastly, oil. So here's the answers we're looking for. It expounds on a little bit. So we can see that not only does it provide lubrication and cooling by, of course, removing heat from the cylinders, and then the oil is cooled itself, but it also provides a seal between the cylinder walls and pistons. And then, of course, as I said before, it carries away contaminants by ultimately filtering through a oil filter. So, again, all these answers to these questions can be found in a myriad of different ways. But if you're just talking about looking at books, you're not watching movies, you're not watching the videos that we recommend in the study guide, you're not going to the online course again, the book that you're looking at most likely in relation to systems is either the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, most likely, or of course the Pilot's Operating Handbook for specific systems knowledge. All right, let's jump into our next question, which is now moving up to a phase 5. So we're going to see the questions kind of move from less of a what type question into more commonly a why, or more specifically a scenario-based question more often. So we step up not only the system's knowledge, but also therefore in association, the awareness to make a good decision in relation to the particular issue at hand. All right, how does the fuel get from the tank to the engine? Let's say once again, we don't have a clue where to find the answer to this question, but let's think about this. Now what we're doing is we're getting back into, of course, more specific systems knowledge. So once again, the best place to head, of course, is the Pilot's Handbook. I'm sorry, the Pilot's Operating Handbook, specifically for our aircraft. So let's head to, excuse me, POH again. And we're looking particularly in this case, of course, obviously for the fuel system. So we could just slide to it if you know where it is. But once again, if you don't know where it is, the best place to head is back to the table of contents, which is exactly what I'm going to do to show you where we can find it there. All right, so do we see it on this page? No, we don't. There we are on the second page we picked up on 7-38 now. We find the fuel system. So let's head to 738. A little too far there. And of course, we can see that there's quite a few pages discussing the fuel system. But specifically what we want to answer right now, of course, is how the fuel gets from the fuel tanks ultimately to the engine. And of course, here's our answer. Now, I could show you a couple more of those videos that I took of the particular engine, but sometimes it's best to look at a diagram at least first to visualize the flow, because admittedly, if we look at the engine, the flow isn't in a perfect linear line, kind of like what we see here, where it goes from point to point to point in kind of a top to bottom view. In the actual airplane, there's components we can, of course, actually see. And then, of course, sometimes the fuel lines are going up vertically, also going downward. So in association, this is the best place to start. Then, highly recommended to take the cowling off an airplane, head over to maintenance, for example, sometime if you're specifically struggling, and then view these individual components. But this is ultimately the answer to the question. Now, are we expecting on the Phase 5 progress check to draw this out? And the answer is no. We definitely don't expect you to draw this out. If you can draw it, hey, that's great, because of course it assists you in visualizing the flow, and then also in association certainly helps you recall things instead of just kind of having to rote memorize it, which of course obviously leads to forgetting things. And of course, ultimately what we most importantly want, which is of course to make sense of the system. So if we look here, starting out, we can of course see that we've got some, use my pencil here. We've got some fuel tanks, of course, is indicated there. And obviously we have 2 wing fuel tanks. Of course, there are floats that via a transducer give us our fuel capacity indication via our electric connection there. We know that, of course, for each individual wing tank, there are 5 drain valves, as we can see indicated here, positioned along each individual wing. Then, once the fuel is introduced to the port or the pickup, there is a screen there that helps ensure that at least large particulate contaminants are contained and are not allowed to be introduced further into the fuel system. What's the first thing that it goes through? Well, it's our fuel selector. And we know, as part of our pre-flight, that the center drain underneath the belly is drained from the fuel selector because it is a low point in the fuel tank. And therefore, water could accumulate in that location. So thus, the importance of draining the fuel from that position. Then after the fuel selector, which kind of has an obvious purpose, it allows us obviously to select both tanks or individual tanks. It's then going to flow to a reservoir tank, which is the closest drain to us, I guess, as we approach the belly from the right wing. And so in association, you've got that drain there as well as the drain for the fuel selector. Let me clean this up a little bit. What's the purpose of the reservoir tank? Well, we can see that there is a return line that reintroduces unused fuel or unselected fuel back to basically a holding position. So that contains the fuel in place, excuse me, to simply then be reintroduced, to then be eventually consumed by the engine. But the point is, of course, that has a low point where water could obviously accumulate. So in association, we drain from there as well. Excuse me. Following that, you then have in line the electric or auxiliary fuel pump. From there, we have a mechanical fuel shutoff valve, which of course is the red knob that we can pull out to literally block the fuel from traversing any further into the system, eventually being introduced into the engine. Then you have a strainer, which is your third belly drain. That, of course, is set up to capture especially fine particulate, fine sediment, for example. And so that's where you certainly likely could pick up any kind of fine sediment if there was any in the system, in addition to, of course, certainly some possibility for water as well. So those are your 3 drains under the belly. That one, the reservoir, and the fuel selector. From there, we flow to the engine-driven fuel pump. And then our fuel air control unit, which is where we ultimately control how much fuel is distributed into the engine, but also that's, for example, where the pickup box for the air intake that you guys check the air filter, the air is introduced into that control unit. And then from there, ultimately goes to the spider, or also known as the fuel distribution unit, by the way, of a fuel flow transducer, which is what gives us our digital indication of our fuel flow. So that way we know how many gallons per hour we're consuming. Now, how well do you need to explain that at a phase 5 as opposed to drawing it out? Well, the most important thing is to have a good grasp on it. The second most important thing is to remember where to look this information up. If you don't know it by heart, then just as important, probably, especially early on, is the knowledge of where did I find this information before? And that's why we want to do this way. I don't want to just give you a slide and tell you this is the way it is. You want to learn this for yourself by ultimately knowing where this information comes from. Yeah, so therefore, if you forgot about this and you're like, I know I'm forgetting something, and you go and you look up the information, you're like, oh yeah, it was the fuel strainer. Then as a project pilot, I'm going to be probably more happy that I know that you know where to look the information up rather than just you memorized it and have no clue otherwise, therefore, where you could find that information if you ever forgot anything about it. All right, let's move ahead. So in this question, what would you do if during your pre-flight inspection someone approaches you for small talk? There's probably a couple of different acceptable answers here. This isn't looking for someone to be cordial. It's probably still best to be cordial. So you could choose to, of course, engage that person in small talk, but what you certainly want to do is save your place in the checklist. At least put your thumb there, if not even maybe mark it in some fashion. You could also just simply tell the person, you know what, I'm sorry, I don't want to get distracted during my pre-flight. Can I finish this first and then I'll come and talk to you? That's perfectly fine in my opinion as well. Basically what we're looking for, of course, here is the reality, the understanding that if you get distracted during your pre-flight, it's very possible you're going to forget some things. You're going to skip some things and not realize you obviously didn't do them. So one way or another, make sure that you avoid that possibility, because that absolutely does happen. And the follow-up, how do you thoroughly inspect the fuel tank venting system? So let's talk about that. As we do our pre-flight walk around, what are we checking for? First of all, obviously, we need to know what is venting our fuel tanks. So let's talk about just some general systems knowledge again. We could certainly get into the specifics. Let's say this time I still don't know what I'm looking for, so I'm going to go to fuel vent and see if I get any luck there. I didn't get any luck. Oh, there we go.
Oh.
No, that's what I'm looking for. I think that's the only one it's going to come up with.
The girls need my help. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry, one second. Okay. So if that doesn't work, then let's try our table of contents and see if we can't find our fuel system. So chapter 7, aircraft systems, we've got power plant. Let's jump ahead and see if we can't find something on basic fuel systems. So there we go. We've got fuel systems on 7-25. So let's jump ahead to that. You're going to use one of those. Altitude is also one of the things. It's a little bit different. So if you're below 18,000 feet, you put A. And then okay, and let's take a look at what they generally refer to here. So we can see what in the world just happened. Sorry, hold on. Altimeter 2990 as we're or 2992 as we're crossing the 18,000. Okay, so hopefully it won't jump ahead like it did. We can see in this basic system, obviously there is a vent. In this case, it's only a singular vent. So how does this work? Well, we can see that they're cross-ventilated in that regard from the right and the left-hand tank, which is in fact actually pretty much exactly how our system works. Now, what they didn't show, of course, is we know that our fuel caps are also vented. So the answer to the question we're looking for is obviously to ensure that the vent for our system is unobstructed. If it is, obviously, we hopefully have a backup in the capacity of our fuel caps. But what are we looking for specifically on the fuel caps? We're first of all, of course, making sure that obviously they secure properly with good O-rings. But we also want to make sure, of course, that we don't see anything obstructing the vent opening itself on either side for that matter. And if you're not aware, there's a little orange cap cover that should also be installed to ensure basically that air is allowed to enter, but nothing else is allowed to enter, or for that matter, I guess technically escape. So those orange caps should be on the bottoms of our fuel caps as well. The key is we're checking all of that. So we're not just checking the vent alone. We also need to check the caps for proper security, but also that they are unobstructed in addition. The second part of the question. or I guess I should say the third part. Why would a inoperative venting system possibly cause an engine failure? Well, let me draw something out for you this time. So I know I said I would use references, but this will be probably better to visualize, as admittedly they don't really have the best illustration here. So let's draw something out. Let's imagine that this is a fuel tank, and we have our pickup port here, and then of course obviously we have flow in this direction, either due to gravity or suction due to some type of pump. And then of course obviously we have a fuel amount. Well, if at any point in time our vent were to become clogged up, right? So of course air is not able to move into this area and therefore fill this volume. As the fuel is consumed or as it exits via the tank, we have a particular problem, because without air able to replace that area, we create a vacuum. And so in other words, you create a low pressure area on this section, which means of course because of its low pressure, it will create suction and try to pull the fuel in this direction, while obviously the fuel is attempting to go this direction. So you get the idea. If the vacuum becomes strong enough in that area, it can actually basically slow, or even worse, fully interrupt our fuel flow to our engine, and therefore in association suffocate our engine. So it's critical therefore that obviously our vents, or also if we have vented caps, are also able to do their job to ensure airflow can get into that area and therefore avoid creating a vacuum. Otherwise, it could possibly cause an engine failure. All right, next question. While over an open field during ground reference maneuvers, the oil pressure annunciator illuminates. What would you do? So let's stop and think about this situation. We're obviously low altitude doing ground reference maneuvers. We're fortunate enough to be over an open field. The question at hand, though, is what's the significance of an oil pressure annunciator? To answer that, of course, you probably need to know, of course, when is the oil pressure annunciator supposed to come on? Where would we find that information to start? Well, no surprises. It's going to be found in specific systems knowledge. So in this case, it's going to be found in the POTS Operating Handbook. All right. So if we're talking about, in this case, excuse me, if we're talking about an oil system related question, then obviously we want to head to the engine and oil system. Now, somewhere in here, they're going to discuss, of course, obviously, particularly in this case, instrumentation in relation to oil pressure. And we find it here under engine instruments. And we find that there is information about specifically when that oil pressure annunciator comes on. So it says a separate low oil pressure switch causes an oil pressure annunciation on the PFD when the oil pressure is between 0 and 20 psi. Well, that definitely tells us, obviously, that if that oil pressure switch is on and it's working properly, we don't probably have much of any oil circulating through the engine. Of course, you guys see this every time you're doing pre-flight, obviously, when the engine's not running, because sure enough, the oil PSI at that point is 0, and thus that's why you see the oil pressure annunciator. So the question at hand then is are you going to have an engine seizure? The answer is there's no guarantee whether the engine will seize up. But if we talk about the likelihood of an engine seizing, it's very much likely. So if we talk about the best decision in this situation, we need to presume that the engine is going to seize. It's simply just a question of how soon it occurs. So do we head to the nearest airport? Well, you're at 1,000 feet. So the question is how close is that airport? And the second question, of course, is how, or I should say, what kind of terrain are you going to have to overfly to get to that airport? it may in fact be the best option is to stay exactly where you are. So if we're talking about a specific example, let me clear up our weather here. Let's imagine, for example, there are literally some fields that we do ground reference maneuvers here just to the east of Lake Louisa. Where is the nearest suitable airport? You could try to go to this glider port if you can even find it. You could try to get to Apopka, but how many miles away is that? That's 15 miles away. And not to mention you have to overfly a lake. You could try climbing, but that means you're just putting more stress on the engine, which means, of course, it's even more likely to seize up. So in other words, probably your best answer in this type of situation is if you have an oil pressure annunciator and you look it over the oil pressure indication and it's reading pretty much, say, sub 20, the best answer is actually to stay where you are and prepare for an engine failure. Maybe even consider landing the airplane under power before it even seizes up to help manage the energy of the airplane. Now, this may be a hard thought to accept, but when you really consider your alternate options, that's basically your best course of action. And Ed and I were discussing this. He brought up an examiner, a well-known examiner in the area that retired, Diego Alfonso, that did the exact same thing. Air traffic control was even telling him he should go to these other airports, and he refused. He stayed over a horse racetrack, which is not a very long straight line, but if you know what you're doing, you can land the airplane well on that. And sure enough, was able to make a successful landing in that situation. So this is your best course of action. If you have a low oil pressure annunciator and an association, the oil pressure is indicating sub 20, you basically need to prepare for an impending engine failure. Like I said, it's just a question of when it's going to occur, not whether or not it's going to occur. All right. All right, well, on your first solo in the practice area, the low volts annunciation illuminates. What do you do? Well, first of all, what does it mean if the low volts annunciator is illuminating? That will be kind of one of the first questions to answer. And of course, obviously, the implications in association. The first and foremost thing to do, of course, in this circumstance, to be honest, just like the last, is make sure you're flying the airplane. If you need to, verbally confirm with yourself that you're flying the airplane. All right, I'm on a heading of such and such. I'm flying towards that lake. I'm holding this altitude. I'm in positive control of the airplane. That way you don't ignore controlling the airplane and therefore possibly lose control of the airplane or maybe lose situational awareness and association. The second thing, of course, obviously, is probably first by attempting to address the situation by obviously going through your checklist. Now, is this an emergency per se? If it's VFR, you're in the practice area. In most cases, at least initially, certainly it's not. Even a full electrical failure obviously can be managed with really, to be honest, minimal effect to safe operations. So where would you find this checklist, therefore? If it's not an emergency, where would it be located? Well, let's pull our checklist back up. This is a kind of a poor example, Emily, because it's not going to be the proper color. So just bear that in mind. It should be not red, but yellow. And it's found on the back side of the abnormal procedures checklist under low voltage annunciator on. So just to run through the first top section here, we can see that it tells us to turn the alternator side of the master switch off. In other words, we're power cycling the alternator, but before we do that, we're checking the circuit breaker on the alternator field circuit breaker to make sure it's in. Now, there's two schools of thought on this, by the way. You could push it in immediately. If it opens again, don't push it in again. There's a second school of thought, which is, do I really, really, really need what I'm trying to re-engage in this situation? Because the breaker opened for a reason. Either the breaker's faulty, admittedly, or we did have some type of excessive load, and in association, the breaker did what it was supposed to. So you have to answer the question, do I really need this equipment compared to the circumstances at hand? In other words, weigh the cost-benefit analysis. What's the risk, by the way, in this situation? Well, it's possible that this could lead to an electrical fire. Unlikely, but fires and airplanes don't mix, so even a low likelihood warrants obviously some consideration. So maybe consider before you even push the breaker back in, how desperately do I need this capability? And then, of course, let's say that it's already in, or you've chose to push the circuit breaker back in. Then you can see that you would turn the alternator side of the master switch back on. And then if things are honky-dory, in other words, you've re-energized the alternator, then in conjunction, we should see this. We should see the low voltage annunciator extinguish. We should see the master, or excuse me, the main bus volts a minimum of 27.5, and then the amps on the battery should also be in a charge as well. All right, we are going to break the rule that I said I was trying to follow, and I'm going to show you a little presentation on the G1000 electrical system. What we're going to do, excuse me, is kind of run through the basics about the electrical system, and then we're also going to talk about the very alternator failure we just discussed. So where is our electrical system? Really what you can do is you can visualize different components, obviously, in different sections of what we're looking at on the screen here. Bear in mind that this is day 182, so you'll see that there's a small set of differences, but largely for the most part, pretty much the same stuff. So obviously when we talk about the electrical system, we have the switches in the top left-hand corner. Then we have the circuit breakers down below, which are organized in buses. So if you've ever wondered, what power strip, if you will, or what bus component is on, all you have to do is just look down there at the circuit breakers, and they are organized in conjunction with the buses that they're on. Then we have our alerts and annunciators, and we have our voltmeters and ammeters. All right, so everybody should be familiar with this, of course. We push the standby battery switch into the test position for 10 seconds, verify that the green test lamp doesn't extinguish. Then, of course, we arm the standby battery. And then at that point, what is happening? This is what's happening. The primary flight display illuminates because the essential bus is powered. So if you want to know what the essential bus comprises of, we've got a breaker for our primary flight display. We have a breaker for the air data computer, which of course gives us all of our airspeed, altitude, vertical speed information, as well as the attitude and heading reference system, or AHRS for short, which gives us our pitch and roll and heading information. We've got a circuit breaker for our navigation radio number 1, as well as the engine airframe unit, which of course is our EIS as well. We've got a circuit breaker for communications radio number 1, and a circuit breaker for our standby instruments. Their indicators have backlighting, so there's a breaker for that. And then, of course, lastly, there's a breaker for the standby battery. That's what's being powered right now, as indicated by the yellow. The yellow means that, of course, we're discharging from the standby battery. And in association, we're drawing from it, so therefore this wouldn't last forever, thus the yellow color coding associating a draw from the battery. All right. So in association, this is obviously what we get when we check the electrical bus volts as well as amps. We get a draw on the standby battery. So we can see that the first thing we obviously check in this the checklist is you check to make sure that the essential bus is at 24 minimum. And that tells you, of course, that the standby battery is in good health. It's where it should be. But this is checking to make sure the standby battery is not powering anything else. If we actually look at the diagram, there are check valves known as diodes that disallow flow from the essential bus to any other electrical components. So you're checking that very aspect. Every single time you guys have done this pre-flight, this is the very thing you're checking for. You're making sure that the standby battery can't power anything else except for the essential bus. In other words, if you saw that the M-bus volts was above 1.5, then it's likely, or at least possible, that the standby battery might be ultimately powering some components on the M-bus. And in association, if this situation occurred in flight where the standby battery was ultimately what was running the essential bus, it would drain faster, or possibly be unpredictable, at least in how long you can expect it to last. So we're checking to make sure that the essential bus is contained, in other words, by that check. We're also making sure that the draw, of course, is indicated on the standby battery. So we can see that there's negative amperage or draw from the standby battery. And in conjunction, the standby battery annunciator is illuminated. All right. So far, so good. So then we turn on the master switch. When we do that, now we can see that the M bus, or now comprised of what we call electrical bus 1 and bus 2, that also feed a cross-feed bus, is indicated there, is also being powered in addition to the essential bus. That means that the master battery, or the main battery, now powers electrical bus 1 and 2, as well as the essential bus. And in the accompaniment, you can see that there's no longer a draw on the standby. There's a draw on the master battery, and there is no standby battery annunciator. All right, we start the engine up. What happens? Well, obviously our belt-driven alternator that is accessorized to the engine crank will then in turn, of course, begin to rotate. And as long as it's operating properly, we now jump from, notice the bus voltage before, 24.5, to now the alternator running the system at its capability at 28. So the buses now run at 28. You can see positive amperage on the master battery as well as the standby battery. And the green color code means that basically this is a sustainable condition. As long as the alternator continues to run, as long as we've got the engine turning that alternator, then this will continue to operate fat and happy with no issues. So when we turn on the avionics switch, of course, bus 1 and 2, then therefore, of course, are powered. And this is your normal operation. There should be no annunciations, right? No alerts. We should see 28 volts. And of course, once the batteries are fully charged, you should see 0 amps because there's no flow in either direction. Everything is fat and happy. It's sustainable. We can continue on like this basically for as long as we can keep the alternator operating. So what happens then in an alternator failure situation? What is our first indication? This is a very likely possible question, for example. Your first indication is not audible, not visually depicted in the CAS window as it's known, or the annunciator window. It's the yellow associated draw from the master battery. That's the first indication. So you are powering, once again, everything via the master battery. And thus, that's why, of course, you have a large amperage, which, of course, obviously means we're depleting the master battery quickly. So that's your first indication. There's not going to be any oral association again. There's not going to be a bunch of flash. It's just a yellow coating down the bottom left-hand corner of the multifunction display. Then, once you drop below 24.5, that's where the bus volts will begin to flash at you. Again, no annunciators, no oral alerts, just a flash. Now, that it does flash back and forth. I wasn't able to do the red and white flash, but those bus meters will ultimately flash back and forth. And that's more likely to catch your attention, even if you're not really looking in that specific area, because, of course, it simulates motion and more likely to grasp your attention. But once again, not audibly yet. Not until we drop below 24 do we then get the low volts annunciation. You also get the flashing warning down in the alert soft key, which that will not stop flashing, nor will the oral alert that chimes every 2 seconds until you acknowledge by pressing that alert soft key. Again, the alert soft key there underneath the warning light. Will that stop the oral alert and then also in association the flash at you? That, of course, acknowledges that the system has gotten your attention and therefore it will stop bugging you. But until, of course, it thinks it has your attention, it's going to keep bugging you. So this is what you would see. You've got bus volts below 24. You've got a draw on the master battery. You've got the low volts annunciator. And, of course, the warning alert soft key down in the bottom right-hand corner. Then once you drop below 20 volts, that's when the standby battery will begin to power. Now, you may think it's going to power everything, but once again, as we just discussed, it's not. It's only going to power the essential bus. The master battery actually continues to power everything else. But at this point, the standby battery kicks on, and that's when you know, based off the manufacturer, you have approximately, for a healthy standby battery, at least 30 minutes, where, of course, the main battery at this point is going to begin to kind of rapidly deteriorate. And in an association, by the way, I forgot to mention, of course, you'll get the standby battery annunciator and a caution alert, just a single audible chime. As the main battery begins to decrease, of course, you can expect the MFD to basically dim down, the audio panel disappear. Basically, everything that we see in the avionics buses will be unavailable unless there's a redundant source of power. So at this point, standby battery is powering the essential bus. And at that moment, like I said, even before the master were to fail, that's when your tick starts down for a 30-minute time frame. Is this enough to get on the ground? Absolutely. Again, we even talked about a full electrical failure would still be manageable in lots of different circumstances. So what do you get on the essential bus one more time? We get a primary flight display, the air data computer, the attitude and heading reference system, navigation radio 1, engine airframe unit, communication radio 1, and power for the standby lights. If you want to look at this again, you can take a picture of it now, take notes, whatever have you. But remember, next time you're doing your pre-flight, all you have to do is look down, look at the circuit breaker panel, and you will see that very picture there showing you what's on the essential bus, for that matter, any other bus as well. And then lastly, we just got a quick picture to show you where the standby battery is. There you can see it's actually located behind the PFD in that case. All right, so now that we have some systems knowledge, of course, we can really figure out what we're going to do. So we would go through our checklist after we verify we were in control of the airplane. If we were unable to remedy the situation, the best solution, obviously, is to just head back to the airport. There's really no need to declare an emergency unless you absolutely feel necessary, because you're going to have plenty of electrical power to get back to your destination. Now, better decision-making on top of this is the consideration to run down the standby battery and then save the master battery for your destination. Why? Well, what did we not see, of course, that was not going to, or what did we not see, of course, that was on the essential bus that we would probably want for landing? And we saw that, of course, flaps was not on there. So if you would like to land with flaps, you may consider using your standby battery to traverse your cruise flight, and then, of course, use your master when you get there. To be perfectly honest, if you catch this early on and you haven't, you just completely ignored the situation, even if you didn't do that, the master battery is going to last certainly long enough to get you back here without really any type of hiccups. All right, phase 10. So things jump up a little bit. We have increased systems knowledge, increased complexity, and perhaps more pressing circumstances. So in this case, we've got, while en route, the oil pressure annunciator illuminates, but upon investigating the current oil pressure, you find it reads normal parameters. The oil temperature also reads within normal parameters, and it's not rising. So how is this possible? And what would you do? So the first thing, of course, to know how this is possible is to understand our system once again. So big surprise, we are going to go back to the specific systems knowledge. So in this case, we're going to the pilot's operating handbook. And we're going to look up some more oil pressure stuff. Well, guess what? We were right where the answer for this information comes from. We can see that there is, first of all, an oil pressure transducer connected to the engine forward oil pressure port. I'll show you a picture if I can find one. Provides a signal to the engine display that is processed and shown as oil pressure. So that's where we get our oil pressure indication. There's also a separate low oil pressure switch that we just talked about. So there's the answer to the question. It's two different components. You have a transducer that gives you your oil pressure, and then you just simply have a basic switch that engages whenever the oil pressure drops below 20 psi that gives you your annunciation. So let's do some deductive reasoning in this situation. We have in an oil pressure annunciating but the current oil pressure and the temperature show normal parameters. They're not showing any signs of any issues. So if we deduce the situation, it's likely that we have a faulty pressure switch. And therefore, probably the oil pressure is okay. In fact, it's very likely it is. And most likely, therefore, will not cause any issues. But remember, there's the second question. What would you do? Your best course of action still is to make a precautionary landing. However, instead of necessarily waiting for your engine to fail, circling over a field like we talked about in the previous situation where all indications are showing an impending issue with the oil, in this circumstance, make a precautionary landing at your nearest suitable airport. You don't need to make an off-field landing unless obviously the other indications begin to indicate some problems. But you should still make a precautionary landing. You would not continue on your way to your destination even if that destination was, say, 30 or 50 miles away, when there's obviously a more suitable practical field that's closer to you. On top of that, even better decision making would, of course, be avoiding populated areas once again. So let's say, for example, let's just create a quick flight plan here. So our destination is Craig Field up in Jacksonville. And this circumstance occurred maybe in this area, let's say right here. I could choose to divert to, Daytona Beach or Ormond Beach, but I am going to have to fly over fairly populated areas to get there, even if it's not the yellow light illumination that we see on the chart. It may, in fact, be better to divert to an airport where I know I'm still over relatively unpopulated areas, and therefore more likely have more forced landing options along the way. That would kind of be your best decision making going forward. But the main thing we're really looking for in this situation is ultimately that you would make a precautionary landing, and basically as soon as practical. Just because even though we're pretty, confident of what likely the situation is, there's no reason to be hanging out in that airplane in case it's not the case. All right, our next one. While on a cross-country flight, the alternator fails. You have attempted to rectify the issue to no avail. So now discuss for us how you would load shed considering the nearest practical airport is 45 minutes away. In other words, you've got to elongate the life of the battery. What can you do to elongate the life of the battery? Well, that requires systems knowledge, and it also requires systems knowledge to a point where you understand what's drawing heavily on the battery. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll go back and we'll look at some of the components here, and then we'll also look at them separately in a separate circuit breaker diagram. Here's your first answer. The first thing you want to drop is the battery basically providing electrical power to a failed alternator. So this isn't something I'm going to get too heavily into just to save time, but if you didn't already know this, an alternator doesn't work exactly like a magneto. A magneto uses a permanent magnet. An alternator uses an electromagnet system, which means that you need to have electrical current to basically turn what's commonly known as kind of the iron core or the rotor in an alternator into an electromagnet. Without it, you won't produce electrical current. So the point is, that alternator's not working. Where do we get power to electrify the alternator? And the answer is the battery. If you want to test this, the next time you go out to the pre-flight, turn on the master switch with both switches on and look at the draw on the master battery. And then turn the alternator side of the master switch off and see how the amperage draw drops. So if we're talking about load shedding, obviously the two things we need to consider is, do we really need this stuff? If we don't need it, then there's no reason to have it on drawing away from the battery. So it's a no-brainer to turn off the alternator side of the master switch because it's not giving you anything. Lights are also a good thing to turn off, but at least they technically give you something by making you be more visible to other aircraft. If you're powering the alternator side of the master switch, I should say just powering the alternator, you're literally wasting electrical power with absolutely no benefit whatsoever. So that's a no-brainer. That should be the first thing to be turned off in this situation. If it's a day flight, you probably can get away, obviously, with turning off pretty much everything here. We shouldn't be using the flaps, obviously, while we're in cruise. We don't need our landing light or beacon. We certainly don't need the fuel pump, the pitot heat. All of those rocker switches, in other words, should certainly be off to elongate the life of the battery. So what it really comes down to is perhaps what you should do in this situation. And this is where we can get some more help, obviously, by referring to the pilot's operating handbook, looking at some checklists in association. So let's jump to that. Take a look at what guidance we have there. So we'll start with the checklist that we have, of course, and then we'll also take a look at what the POH specifically talks about. So same checklist we were looking at before. What guidance do we get in this checklist? Well, we can see it, in fact, already actually tells you to do the thing that we very much just talked about. It will tell you to turn off the alternator side, but now you know why. You're doing it because it's drawing away from the battery. Then it says non-essential electrical off, avionics bus 1 switch off, COM 1 and NAV 1 tuned to the active frequencies and select, and then avionics switches bus 2 leave on if you're an IMC, but we're not in this situation, so we'll turn off. And then obviously we're trying to get to that destination airport. So we've literally turned pretty much everything off except for the essential bus. And therefore, by doing so, we've elongated the life of the battery significantly. How much? Well, if we were to really start looking at the amperage draw, we saw on the, at least on the slide, it doesn't necessarily mean that that it would be that exact number, but on the slide where we initially had the failure, we had a pretty significant draw, 18.5 amps. If you load shed down to your minimum amount, you can probably drop that by down to a 1/6 of that, to probably 3-4 amps, maybe even less than that if you were to dim the screens down. In other words, you could really elongate the life of the battery to probably, you can't state this officially, but it could last for hours if you reduce the draw that significantly. So follow the checklist. When in doubt, know, of course, obviously what you're going to lose in association. If we look, avionics bus 1 is basically largely a redundant source of power to what we see in the essential bus. You can see there's both power sources for the PFD, power sources for the ADC and AHARS, power sources for NAV1 and the engine. And then depending on the airplane, you get some different stuff here. So therefore, when you guys turn on the avionics and you think of the avionics coming on, you're probably thinking of this. The MFD, the transponder, NAV2 and COM2, the audio panel, and the autopilot. That's what you're going to lose. But can you fly the airplane? Certainly. So load shedding is going to elongate the life of the battery and, more importantly, allow you to use the battery when you get to your destination, which, of course, is where usually most of the components that you need are more critical in that circumstance anyways. All right. Next, while in flight, if the oil filter were to clog, would there be any possible signs of this occurring? Secondly, would the engine fail? Anybody have any feedback on that? Anybody have an answer? No? All right, I'll answer. All right, so let's figure out where we're going to find the answer to this. For one, big surprise. We're going to find it in the POH. So let's head to the POH. Let's first find out what we're talking about, the full flow oil filter. let's do some gandering. So if we look at here, we're basically talking more or less about the engine indications. So we're unlikely necessarily to see it here, but if we did a search, what would be the best word to put in? Let's try filter. Don't see anything pop up on this screen. Let's try going here. Oh wait, you know what? That's not the right one. Sorry. There's a voluntary training program on the self improve their skills and build their confidence. The pilot edge control will then make it determine when you're doing the training if the task is successfully so. You pass that rating and move on to subsequent training. Training. There aren't any reasons that everything can. All right. First of all, let's find out where, of course, what we're talking about. So we can see, first of all, here. We looked at this earlier, but we can see that one of the listed accessories on our engine, of course, is the full flow oil filter. So that's a start. We know that the oil filter obviously is mounted on the rear of the engine accessory case. The question is really two possibilities. Either the oil pressure is clogged up because the oil filter clogs, or we have some type of bypass in association that allows oil to flow unfiltered through the engine. So it's one of those two options, and you guys would probably guess which one it's obviously going to be. If the system is well engineered, it's kind of obvious what it should be, but where would we find this information? So let's continue to do some searching. We see engine instruments. We see fuel flow. We already took a look at the oil pressure section. Excuse me. We continue here. We saw earlier on, this of course is where we talked about the oil pressure transducer and the oil pressure switch. We can see there's some discussion, of course, on the oil temperature sensor, cylinder head temperature, exhaust gas temperature. We get into engine lubrication. This is sounding a little warmer. And of course, we looked at this earlier. So let's see if we can find the answer here. Let's start where we had kind of left off. Let's say we can see right here it says oil from the pump passes through a full flow oil filter, a pressure relief valve at the rear of the right oil gallery, and a thermostatically controlled remote oil cooler, which of course is how we cool the oil. Well, let's continue on, and we can see here we are. We're looking for that answer right there. So the filter adapter in the full flow oil filter is equipped with a bypass valve, which will cause lubricating oil to bypass the filter in the event it becomes plugged or the oil temperature is extremely cold. So no, the oil will not stop flowing if the oil filter is clogged in this system. It will continue to run properly in association. Okay, what about any kind of indications? Largely, there wouldn't be too significant of a change except possibly an increase in oil pressure. You therefore generally won't necessarily know that this has occurred on its own, at least on the initial flight, I should say. So there won't be too significant of an effect on the oil pressure flow as far as the dangerous situation. The engine should continue to run. My system just crashed, so hold on one second. We get back to our place here. All right, guys, we are almost done. How does the attitude and heading reference system provide roll and pitch information? Warm enough, same place. So let's head back to that POH and take a look at the attitude and heading reference system. And this will pretty much cover what we're looking for tonight. So there is literally a section on the avionics in the airplane. And that'll be found basically towards the end of section 7. You can see that, of course, it begins to get into individual avionics components for the airplane. And then we find ultimately what we're looking for here. we can see that the AHARS contains accelerometers, which are basically like little tuning forks or cantilevers that swing back and forth when loads imposed upon it. Tilt sensors, which simply just can sense when something's tilting based off gravitational pull. And rate sensors, which kind of work the same way as accelerometers that replace big spinning gyros. There's no laser gyros. There's no mass spinning gyros used in other airplanes. And then it also, of course, incorporates the magnetometer located in the left wing, which is what provides us our heading information. And you know what? My last question got deleted somehow, so I'll have to ask that myself. So the last question is, excuse me. Let's say that we're taking off and we have a bug that flies into our pitot tube and obstructs the opening for the pitot tube. The question is how is that going to affect our aircraft systems? And in association, what can we do about it? So this is more general systems knowledge. So to answer this last question, we're headed back to the PHAC. And once again, we're going to go to the table of contents and try to find information about our flight instrument information. So we've got flight controls, we've got aircraft systems, we've got aerodynamics of flights, and we have in Chapter 8 flight instruments. And in this case, we're looking specifically for the pitot static flight instruments. So we're going to go to Chapter 8-1. And here is what we have. So in this situation, we imagine that a bug has obstructed this opening here. So there's no ram airflow into the airspeed indication. We are still getting static indications to our airspeed indicator. So one of two things has happened. Either the bug goes so far up into the system that it obstructs the drain hole as well, and therefore there is basically a locked amount of pressure between the airspeed indicator and the end of the pitot tube, or the bug is just blocking the opening again, and the drain hole is allowing static pressure to enter in comparison to static pressure from the static port. In this case, there would be no difference between the two. So the processor that computes the difference between, again, the ram airflow coming in through the pitot tube opening and the static ambient pressure from the static port ultimately is able to determine, therefore, what our speed is, because obviously the ram air is obviously going to be much higher compared to the much lower static pressure, and therefore the higher the ram air pressure, the higher the airspeed readout. However, if there's no ram air pressure, just static air pressure, and static air pressure, well, those pressures are going to be equivalent. And if there's no difference between the two, then it's the same as if we were sitting on the ramp. What does our airspeed indicate when we're sitting on the ramp? It's a big fat 0. So that's one of the possibilities. The airspeed indicator could go to 0 if that occurred. If, however, the bug blocked pressure up in the line, it's the same as when I blow up a balloon and I trap air in the balloon. That air is under pressure. So now you have a certain amount of ram air pressure that's just stuck in there. It doesn't change. So that no matter how fast or slow you go, that's what you're going to get. It just continues to indicate the exact same airspeed no matter what, unless you climb or descend. And the only reason why it changes at that point is because the ambient pressure changes. Whereas the pressure here remains the same. So as you climb, the ambient pressure will go down, and therefore it indicates an increase in airspeed even though you're not necessarily going faster. In other words, at that point, the airspeed indicator is useless. It doesn't tell you anything, and therefore you should disavow that information. Okay. So what can you do to fix this? Well, you can't obviously unclog the pitot tube, and there's no backup like there is the static port. So your only solution is to find an alternate means of some type of indication of airspeed. So we have ground speed obviously indicated in the G1000, but even for that matter, you do, if you have some type of tablet, you can bring up, of course, some type of indication. So we can see down the bottom left-hand corner of my screen there, a ground speed, which of course I'm not moving. So therefore, I obviously am not indicating any ground speed. So that's not going to be, of course, a direct indication of your airspeed, but at least it will be certainly better than nothing at all. That being said, remember, if you know your airplane, then even if you don't have an airspeed indication, you still know what the airplane is doing. So we know for this airplane that even if I can't see my airspeed indication, if I'm using 2300 RPM and I'm holding 1 degree nose up pitch, I should expect 100 knots. In the same way that if I'm on final approach, I know that if I have a configuration of 1500 RPM and about 2 to 3 degrees nose down with, say, different flap configurations, that should give me different airspeeds. So you don't necessarily need an airspeed indicator to continue to fly the airplane if you know how the airplane will behave for given different combinations of pitch and power. All right, guys, that's it for me. Thanks again for watching. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them in the Dropbox window or email me at evan@ftpros.com.